Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special deep dive webinar with John Liu here co-hosting. Welcome, John.
Hello, it's me.
And we're here with Leila Darwish. Hi, Leila.
Hey, thrilled to be here.
Now, Leila, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you get this book, Earth Repair. She's the author of Earth Repair. She works with bioremediation, and she's a fabulous person. She also works in some natural disaster and response preparation and management, and all sorts of good things. Welcome, Leila.
Thank you.
We got people from all over here. I want to remind everybody again that there's a question and answer box to collect your questions as they come in, and we'll collect those and get to those later. And then if you want to chat, there's the chat box over there. So Leila, you want to introduce yourself, and then I know you got a presentation too. We're going to get to, and we'll chat some. So.
Sure. Yeah. So I am Leila, as Tim said, and in terms of my background, I spent I think a good 15 years doing environmental justice work and community organizing, and that's kind of what led me into learning more about bioremediation, because I was doing a lot of work with communities that were dealing with toxic land and toxic water, and getting sick because of it, and also being quite brokenhearted because of what they were having to live with when you're attached to the land. And so I kind of was inspired from stuff I learned in permaculture, but also wanting to go farther than that into how do we give people the tools to start doing ecosystem healing and ecosystem repair, because often we're depending on governments and companies to do that, and they don't have the heart to do it well. Or it's not financially, doesn't make sense for them, even though it's what we all need to be doing for the land. So it was something I just wanted to learn more about and find a way to make accessible for people to do in community, and be able to respond to some of the environmental crises that we've inherited and that are kind of ongoing. And I'm also really passionate about disasters. Right now, actually, my life is kind of taking a bit of a swing into emergency management and doing disaster response, which is why I'm in New Orleans right now. So I kind of tend to blend the two. I'm originally from Alberta. So shout out to the people from Alberta and BC on the webinar. But that was also a big part of kind of pushing me in this path, because I come from a place where oil extraction is huge and leaves behind a lot of damage and a lot of toxicity. And whether you come from a place where people are extracting oil or you live anywhere where oil is being used, there's just always that constant threat of oil spills, right? It's from trucks, from pipelines, from tankers. And that was something that kind of growing up and watching oil spills happen and watching the destruction, I always wanted to find a way to also address it and deal with it. So yeah, that's kind of a bit about me. I'm going to be presenting about bioremediation today, and then we're going to talk about it. And I will hopefully not speak too quickly, but I have a lot of slides to cover, so I can't promise that. But maybe John can flag me if I start to run too fast. Sound good? Yeah, hands up. All right, do I just start, or do I just do the share screen thing? I've never actually done a webinar before. I usually present directly to people, so.
So yeah, go ahead and do your share screen, and let's see.
Is it working?
You need to make it full.
Oh, wait for it. I got skills.
Boom.
What about now?
Yeah.
We're good? Okay, so let's get started. So I like to call it, when I'm talking about bioremediation, I like to think of it as regenerative remedies for toxic realities. Oh, wait, let's see if I can actually make this. There we go. And as a definition, I think there's a lot of different definitions out there, but for me, it's kind of allying with living systems to detoxify and regenerate contaminated environments. And we do this by binding, extracting, and or transforming different contaminants. And by contaminants, I'm talking about chemicals, heavy metals, persistent organic pollutants, things like that. And different chemicals you're going to be dealing with, different chemicals, different metals have different things. So when we're talking about metals, we're always talking about either extracting or binding. When we're talking about chemicals, it's more of how do we kind of extract and transform it, right? With heavy metals, you can't really break them down. So there's like a different pathway. And in terms of kind of the different areas of bioremediation, we talk about microbial remediation, which is working with bacteria, phytoremediation, which is working with plants, and then everybody's favorite, most sexy topic is microremediation, which is working with fungi. And I'm always trying to push people to go beyond fungi and kind of look at everything, because you kind of have to use these together, different phases, different kind of tools, and you never want to get too too tunnel vision with it. So all of them are sexy, not just fungi. So some of the reasons why we do bioremediation, food justice, food security is a big reason I got into it. I used to do farming, and if you're doing any kind of farming in definitely in urban areas, you're going to be dealing with heavy metals and different contaminants in the soil because of how we've built and what we've done to the land that is around us, especially in urban areas. I mean, it's not uncommon to find lead, cadmium, things like that. And so if you're trying to actually, grow your food locally and you want to do it in a healthy way, you got to find a way to heal that soil. And again, going deeper than just saying, I'm going to build a box and, mine soil somewhere and then bring it in. How do you actually heal the land that's been destroyed underneath you and then start kind of working with something more in place and more healthy? And so that's a huge piece. The other piece of why we do bioremediation is that we are kind of constantly dealing with environmental disasters, whether it's oil spills or mining disasters, fracking, things like that. The lands and the waters around us are getting contaminated. And again, some of them are these acute things, like we have a tanker spill, or as you see in the left of the screen, that's the BP Gulf Horizon spill. Or it's something that's more of left behind by industry. So at the bottom left of the corner, this is a tar pit of basically old oil that was left behind in Ecuador in the Amazon by Texaco and Chevron. And again, it's like people are living here and they're dealing with incredible high rates of cancer. It's flowing into the land. It's contaminated everything. And in industry and government, sometimes they'll just leave it behind and be like, meh, can't do anything about it, or we don't want to. But people live there and people have to live in that environment, and we have to look at solutions on what can we do to make that better. The picture on the right, kind of bottom, is actually a major mining disaster that happened in Canada. And these are not places where necessarily remediation has happened, but it's that driving force that has to push us to be like, how could we do this here? Because the endpoint that usually ends up with their cleanup doesn't go far enough or doesn't happen at all. And I have a little sign about Fukushima at the top because nuclear radiation, accidents, nuclear waste is always an issue. And there is some studies that have been done and some things in bioremediation where they said, hey, this plant can pull that up, or this mushroom can hyperaccumulate these kind of radioactive elements. But really in the end with nuclear, there is nothing that's helpful, in the sense of even when you pull it up, you still end up with this really radioactive toxic situation that we don't know how to dispose of. So we can't deal with this with all ecological disasters, but we still have to try, and there are some tools kind of in each toolkit to kind of play with. The other thing that kind of, again, pushes me a lot is natural disasters, and how we have natural disasters that create environmental disasters and toxicity. And if people on the left-hand side, you have kind of that kind of oil landscape, that is from Texas and Hurricane Harvey. When Hurricane Harvey hit, it caused all this flooding and all these oil spills, and the water kind of got moved around, and then it kind of goes away, and it's left in people's kind of surrounding neighborhoods and in the kind of ground around them. And so people have to think about that. When we have hurricanes, when we have floods, we do get these, because of our toxic infrastructure, we do get this toxic kind of moving around. And then on the right, kind of a picture that's far too familiar to folks in California and in a lot of places, is wildfires. And again, when wildfires burn in a forest, you're not necessarily dealing with that level of toxicity, but because of how we've built our homes and our buildings, when they burn towns and areas around it, we end up with toxic ash and things like that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in terms of some of the remediation options. Now, because a lot of people on this webinar are restoration folks, because this is a restoration deep dive webinar, I just wanted to say that, to me, you kind of have to integrate the two. So you can't just be thinking about restoration. You can't be like, I'm just going to take this degraded earth and put some trees on it and we're good. If that place is contaminated, you got to go deeper. And it's that kind of concept where some landscapes are degraded and not contaminated, some are both. And and how do we actually address that? And we have to work with nature to detoxify the land if we want to kind of do the most complete healing, and if we also want to give the trees and the plants that we're trying to bring in a chance to actually settle and do well. And I think bioremediation is kind of adding to that diversity of solutions that we have and building up our toolkit, so that when we're looking at, if you want to do restoration in a landscape where there was a huge fire and there's a lot of toxic ash left behind, you got to be thinking about, how are we going to make sure that this ash isn't getting into our streams? How are we going to make sure that this toxic ash, which has heavy metals and, pHs and a lot of different things, how are we dealing with it and healing the land so that people are safe to be there and they can grow their food and they can do good things? And so we got to be thinking about all the different pieces, because we do have toxic legacies that we've inherited, and we do have to deal with disasters more and more in kind of our climate chaotic world. I wanted to do a quick reality check because one of the things about bioremediation is there's a lot of hype and a lot of people buying into the sexiness of it and then not doing it well. It is cheaper than conventional remediation. So when I'm talking conventional remediation, if you have a piece of land that has contamination, has heavy metals, has chemicals, whatnot, one of the most common things people will do is dig and dump, where they'll dig up that whole kind of bunch of soil and then haul it away and dump it somewhere else, usually in a neighborhood or a community that is marginalized, that is dealing with race and clash and poverty and stuff like that. And it kind of is what we tend to do with contaminated earth. And there's a whole bunch of other ways that kind of industry and government kind of handle things conventionally that can get more and more expensive and more intensive in terms of energy and machinery. With bioremediation, we're kind of aiming more for in situ remediation. We're aiming at how do we kind of heal things in place so we don't create toxic legacies elsewhere, and how do we heal it with the tools that are affordable and accessible to us as people in a community. By that account, it means that the work is very time and labor intensive. This isn't something where you can just take a product and put it on it or pick it up and move it. You're working kind of day in and day out for seasons trying to heal and kind of deal with this problem. And so I always want people to understand it is time and labor intensive. It's not a quick fix, and you have to be committed to do it. And I mean, some sites can take, maybe it takes a season. Others, it can take multiple seasons. Some sites, you are dealing with such an interesting profile of what you have. You don't just have one metal or one chemical. You might have a bunch. You might have a toxic soup. And then you have to kind of target your solutions in different phases to deal with different things. Another thing on a reality check is that chemicals are different than metals. And, you can't break down a metal. So there's been stories of people using plants to pull up heavy metals and then being really excited and then composting the plant down because they assume that the plant turned the metal into something special and magical and it's not harmful anymore. They compost the plant down and then they take that compost and spread it on their garden and think that they did a good thing. And instead they just condensed it and respread it. And so we need people to understand that, some chemicals you can break down. With metals, you are not breaking them down. You are extracting them to move them somewhere. And then you still got to deal with that, or you're finding ways to immobilize them and make them less able to kind of get into your water, get in and onto your plants. And so again, different solutions. And it doesn't help to cut corners because you just, you don't get the job done. Everything that you're doing is site and contaminant specific. So again, we always see people getting really excited about microremediation, working with mushrooms. And, they might see an oil spill and say, oh my God, I want to go and sprinkle mycelium on a beach where it's like baking in the sun and the waves are coming in and just pulling it right out. Right. And that's not your best answer. It's not your best solution. Or you might want to be doing microremediation on a sun-baked piece of desert. That's not going to work unless you do a lot to modify your environment, whereas working with plants and bacteria might be a better option. And so I think we really got to kind of look at the sites we're working with, figure out what they need, what's already going on the site, and then kind of integrate our solutions into that, and also understand the contaminants. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who have lead as a contaminant, and all they want to do is use mushrooms to deal with the lead, whereas that's not the most efficient solution. There are plants and there are mobilization techniques that would be far quicker and far better, but they read one book on mushrooms and that's how they want to go. And again, we want to push away from that, because if you're a healer, and I think anyone who's doing remediation or restoration work is kind of taking on that obligation and that responsibility of being a healer, you want to do the right thing and actually, pay attention and kind of just do the thing that actually matches the problem. The other thing is nature works with a diversity of solutions. And so again, we're not just doing one over the other. We're actually integrating a bunch of these different pieces because they also need each other to live. Plants need a really strong soil ecosystem, and you need to do sometimes microbial remediation to kind of bring that back, right? The other thing I want to mention is that there's kind of different levels of easiness, and easy is a relative term because it's all a bit challenging, but if you're working with land, I think that's an easier kind of thing to work with if you don't have a lot of money and machinery. Then comes surface water. And then when you're kind of working with the contamination of groundwater, you're in a completely different situation in terms of being able to get at it and access it. And that's really difficult. And so just something to keep in mind. I also like to remind people to do no harm. And so again, you're working with a landscape that's already been impacted. you gotta be careful. And a lot of this kind of comes around things like invasive species. If you are looking at bringing in certain invasive species, who some of them are good phytoremediators, and you're bringing it into a landscape that's out of balance, you're going to create more problems. And so again, kind of pulling back and being like, what am I doing? Is this going to help, or is it going to hurt the land? And you're dealing with land that's in a vulnerable state, so you gotta be conscious. With all this work, there's a lot of promise and a lot of potential with it, but it hasn't necessarily scaled up to kind of hit some of those bigger problems I was talking about earlier. And we're constantly working with that. And the only way we get to scale up is if we keep scaling up and we keep experimenting and having people try things. So we're still kind of there. I don't want anyone to think that we're at a certain level that we're not. I think another thing to consider when you're doing any kind of bioremediation, especially if you're looking at doing it in kind of response to disasters, whether it's an oil spill or a fire, you have to have some of your stuff ready. You can't kind of be like, oh, I want to do microfiltration because we just had a fire go through, and I don't want to see this ash go into the stream, but you don't have any of your microfilters kind of ready. And that can take weeks and months to prepare. And so we have to sometimes consider, how do we pre-position resources? How do we also set up relationships with different people in our community who have access to the things we need? Like folks who have nurseries, folks who are incredible with compost and composting, people who are mushroom farmers or who have access to wood chips. We need to kind of have all this ecosystem internally prepared so that we can actually mount an effective response. And then finally on reality check, I'm just going to get this all out, is that with a lot of these things, prevention is the best medicine. I mean, in the sense that if you've inherited land in urban areas that's already dealing with so many levels of kind of contamination because of how we used to paint our houses with lead-based paint, or our gasoline used to have lead in it. Like if we're dealing with that, prevention is not really what we're working with. We're just dealing with the problem. But when it comes to things like oil spills, when it comes to things like nuclear, they are really hard to clean up. And if you can keep those things, like if you can keep some of those projects from going forward, then you don't have to deal with this part of it, which is incredibly challenging. So I always say to people, you got to try to fight this stuff before you have to deal with it, ideally. So now getting into the fun stuff. I want to talk about microbial remediation first. I leave mushrooms to the end because I want to make people wait for it. So with microbes, what we're really dealing with, there's a bunch of different pictures here. When we talk about microbial remediation, we're talking about things like working with actively aerated compost tea, compost, biochar, finding ways to compost certain contaminants, certain chemicals to kind of break them down. And a lot of people on the webinar, they might be already familiar with these tools because we've used this in farming, we've used this in permaculture, but when you're doing it with bioremediation, you're taking it a step up. You have to do it to a different level, and you're kind of integrating different pieces into it. We're not going to have time in this webinar to really go deep with that because that would be a whole thing in itself, but we'll just touch on a few things. So one of the big things with microbial remediation is we are trying to bring in beneficial microorganisms to either kind of like recharge and kind of restart the soil food web and kind of get that going, because in very degraded landscapes that have been poisoned, that suffers. And we lose a lot of that diversity in the soil. And if you have an unhealthy soil food web, you can't really sustain a lot of the stuff that goes on top of it. But more importantly, a lot of these beneficial bacteria and microbes have their own abilities in terms of immobilizing contaminants or breaking them down. And so, especially with chemicals. And so what we're trying to do using things like compost tea and certain types of compost is we're trying to bring in these different bacteria and kind of re-inoculate our sites and kind of amp that up as much as we can. And by bringing them in, we're actually bringing the capabilities to break things down when it comes to chemicals. So we're always kind of trying to design our microbial remediation to have the highest level of diversity of microbes and huge quantities of them. And how we do that is often based on like how we create our compost and our compost tea. We have to do composting in a certain way, like thermophilic composting. We're trying to integrate certain things in terms of the different materials we're using. So an example of this is when people are trying to create really good compost to kind of re-inoculate a site. And it's not just re-inoculating a site, you're also building your soil up. So if you have contaminated soil and you're actually bringing in clean, really microbial rich soil, that also helps in terms of what you're planting into it, and also covering up some of the contamination, which can be an issue in certain situations. But we're just trying to design our microbe stuff for having the right kind of temperature situation. We want to oxygenate it because a lot of the compost, a lot of the microbes we're working with need that kind of aerobic environment, we're putting the right kind of food sources for them. And we also are designing for maximum surface area so that we can get as many microbes kind of doing their job as possible. So when it comes to composting, I like to call it microorgasmic compost, which is different than just regular compost, because not all compost is created equal. And again, this makes a difference when you're like, I am trying to do this to bring in the right microorganisms to break down a really nasty chemical. When you are doing this kind of compost, just a few things to even think about besides just really following, like, how do I do good thermophilic composting? Adding sources of phosphorus into your compost. Phosphorus is really amazing in terms of being a food for bacteria and really kind of jumpstarting their activity, but also it's really good for binding certain heavy metals like lead. And so someone I know who does a lot of microbial remediation was saying, finding ways to put things like adding chicken manure, that's an easy source, or certain green manures that we work with like buckwheat or sorrel and stuff that have phosphorus in it, trying to find a way to incorporate that into your compost, trying to find a way to incorporate worm castings if you have it, because worm castings have this one particular bacteria called Pseudomonas florensis, which is found in the gut of the worm. And it is one of the bacteria that's known to like to break down oil. And we have people doing, when it comes to microbial remediation, industry does a bit of it. And what they often do is they work with labs where they've isolated very specific bacteria and then kind of bring them out into solution. I think a lot of people in communities don't have access to those resources. So we got to think about, how do we find those in natural sources? And again, worm castings is an incredible thing, especially if you're dealing with oil, is kind of bringing that into your compost and kind of bringing that out onto the land. So that's one thing in terms of using compost and doing it the right way to inoculate a site, to also build the soil up. The other thing, I'm gonna skip that. The other thing is compost tea is another way to do it. And with compost tea, we're using it again to inoculate our site with microorganisms. And also to, again, help with the breakdown. And so if you have contaminated soil and you're able to kind of isolate it in a certain way and kind of keep exposing it to the right kind of actively aerated compost tea with the right kind of bacteria that can break down your chemical that you have in there, it can be a good way to go. Because again, we're trying to bring the bacteria onto the site. And again, you're trying to make your compost tea in such a way that you are producing huge amounts of bacteria and a diversity of characters, because you don't know which one is going to break down your contaminant, right? And so you have to kind of design for diversity. And one of the things that we see often with compost tea is that a lot of people say that they do it, and they don't do it right. I think we've all met those people who say they have incredible compost tea, and you come over and it's a bucket with plants in it, or it's a bucket with some compost, but there's not enough oxygen. And the compost they're using is anaerobic. And if you do that, if you don't have the right inoculant, and if you're not properly oxygenating your compost tea, you're not going to get the product you need to actually inoculate and break down the contaminants that you're looking for. So it's really important you do it well. You have the right kind of oxygenation. There's a lot of DIY kind of things online, and I'm guilty of this. I used to think I was an amazing actively aerated compost tea person, where I had an aquarium pump, and I would get it all set up and do my thing. And one of the key components, talking to Ingham about this, is you have to have your compost tea bubbling in such a way that it's breaking the surface, like it's a churning, rolling boil. And aquarium pumps are meant for fish, so they're not meant to kick the shit out of fish. So you actually have to get the right kind of aeration so that you're really oxygenating the water. You have to have the right kind of inoculants, which means you have incredible compost that already has the microorganisms in it. You bring in your worm castings to get that petrophilic kind of bacteria introduced, and then you have to feed them, give them the situation they need, so you have your solution, and then bring it out onto the land, right? So I really encourage people to do this, but do it right, because if you do it wrong, you're just making sweet water that smells like molasses and looks brown, and nothing really happens when you do that. Biochar, another thing to think about. So biochar, there's a lot of beautiful things to say about biochar and working with biochar. In the context of remediation, some of the properties it has is, again, if you look at the picture on the right, that's kind of looking at it under the microscope in terms of it creates incredible habitat for microorganisms. So if you put it into soil, you're actually opening up the amount of area, like livable space, for different bacteria to kind of take over, which means you can actually hold more in your soil and bring kind of, like, I've heard people talk about biochar like it's like a super condo for microorganisms. So again, you're increasing capacity, you're increasing surface area. It also has binding capabilities and the ability to immobilize certain heavy metals, which is important. So biochar is a really good thing to work with. Another thing with kind of microbial remediation, I have a friend who does a lot of kind of dealing with oil spills and kind of hydrocarbon contamination. And he composts. He does this thing where he does a thermophilic compost of oil contaminated soil. And this is something that you got to be careful with. You got to do it right, because, you know, there's a lot of things you're worried with in terms of off-gassing. Whenever we're working with things like petrochemicals, you have to worry about things like volatile organic compounds like benzene and things like that, and breathing it in. And those are not healthy to breathe in. And you're also worried about things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So it's not something that I think everyone should do, but it's something that has been done where people have found success, where you actually take oil contaminated soil, you kind of build it into a thermophilic compost, you add in some of the things I've already talked about in terms of worm castings, phosphorus, things like that, to kind of jumpstart and kind of give either the right kind of bacteria or kind of feed the bacteria that are present. And then you get it into that thermophilic composting kind of process. And what he would do is have that going on, and then continually kind of every so often inoculate it with his own version of actively aerated compost tea that had very specific petrophilic bacteria in it. So it'd be kind of bringing that compost up, getting it cooking, turning it, spraying it with the kind of the bacterial inoculant, and kind of continuing that for a while, and was able to really degrade and break down the oil. So that is one thing to do. But if you're doing it, you want to be, again, not using pitchforks. You want to be kind of using a front end loader. You want to be wearing a respirator, because as you can see, there's fumes coming off it, and you don't want to really put it upwind of a school or a daycare. Like, it's all these things you got to think about, because this is kind of dangerous stuff and has impacts on health. So those are just a few. Again, you can go really deep into how you do microbial remediation, but these are just a few of the kind of ways we can kind of engage with it. And I always encourage people that you want to become good at this. It's like, you have to become good at composting. You have to invest in a few things to make really good compost tea. And if you do that, then you're kind of able to do a lot. And I've found, again, that microbial remediation is really good when we're looking at immobilizing heavy metals and also building soil up. And then also when it comes to breaking down things like oil, they've done really interesting research on things like glyphosate, the chemical that's in Roundup, and kind of using it to break that down as well. And so it's something to kind of consider. You know? Now, phyto, moving on to plants. This is a very popular one, and also in some ways a lot easier for folks to kind of conceptualize, because you can see it. And a lot of us know how to work with plants. So the picture to the left is actually a bioremediation installation that happened in New Orleans post-Katrina, where they were using sunflowers to pull up different heavy metals. In the bottom left, the yellow flower, that is brown mustard, which is also a really good remediation plant when it comes to heavy metals. Picture to the right in the top is alpine pennycress, which is one of the superstars when it comes to lead extraction. People get really excited about using sunflowers for lead, and because it looks like hope embodied, like it's more of the visual, but it's actually, lead is very difficult to pull up. It's a very kind of heavy, slow moving metal, and it doesn't move that easily with the sunflowers. Whereas with alpine pennycress, that's one of the few plants that actually does it more efficiently. And then phytoremediation, you know, we get into our trees and things like willow that are really good at breaking down kind of petrochemicals, right? And things like oil. So there's a lot there. One thing with phytoremediation is that plants can only really clean up the contamination as far as their roots can grow. So again, if you have, let's say, an old gas station, and you have one of those, like, they call them leaking underground storage tanks. The acronym is LUST, which is creepy, but a lot of old gas stations have these underground storage tanks that, you know, they've leaked hydrocarbons and everything, and people want to use phytoremediation. So they plant a bunch of sunflowers on the old gas station, and they give themselves a high five, and they think that they healed the thing. But if the roots can't get to where the contamination is, you're not doing anything, except it looks nice. And maybe you're doing something in the first few layers of the soil, but you have to think in those situations, how do we either get something that's deeper rooted, and that's kind of moving into trees, or how do we bring that soil up? What do we do with that? Because again, you have to be working with, the plant can only get what it can get. Phytoremediation is also something, it's good for low to moderate contamination. If an environment is so toxic that it's going to poison your plant, then you're not going to do well. And so often we also have to work with microbial remediation with the phyto to kind of, again, give the plants the ability to actually grow, right? Like, you need that soil, you need kind of clean compost, all that stuff to kind of give it that capacity to take root and live on these environments and these ecosystems that are very hard to sometimes get a start on. You can also use plants to kind of keep contamination from moving off site in terms of intercepting runoff, stabilizing the soil. And then one of the biggest things with phytoremediation, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, is that when we're using plants to hyperaccumulate heavy metals, they can become toxic waste themselves because you've moved the metal out of the soil into the plant. And now what are you going to do? And again, that's a constant question. Any workshop I've ever done, people are always like, the moment you bring it up, they want to talk about it. Now, just a few, I'm not going to go into this really deep, but just to give people an idea, there's been a lot of research done on, different chemicals and what plants can remediate different chemicals. And these are the plants that I have listed here. I also have them listed in my book. These are different plants that have been kind of in peer reviewed in research to be like, this works. Because the other thing we see with remediation is you'll just find lists on the internet of people saying, well, this does this and this does that, but it hasn't actually been tested. It's just kind of word of mouth. And so I feel like, it's good to kind of say, okay, these are the ones that actually work. There's a lot of plants on here that, work in your environment or don't. There's also a lot of plants that aren't on here that haven't been tested necessarily, but doesn't mean they don't work. Because a lot of the research, it wasn't necessarily working with native species. And I think that's really important. And one of the things that we do when we go onto a site is you look at a site and you see what's already growing there. And some of the plants that are already growing on a contaminated site might be there because nature is brilliant and has already sent in the first responders. So those might be species to look at and say, hey, it's actually breaking down that contaminant. That's not always the case though, because some plants that are growing there are just tolerant. So it's the difference between who is your responder and who's just kind of tolerant. But it is always that kind of place of observation to say, what other plants should we be looking at? And I also want to make a note that some of the plants you see here, this is a lot from, I don't speak other languages besides English, French, and Spanish. So when I'm doing my research, I'm relegated to certain papers that have certain plant lists. But that doesn't mean places in China, places where people are doing incredible phytoremediation, there might be whole other lists of plants that they're finding there that are doing this. And so this is not a comprehensive list. This is just a few kind of more in that North American kind of vision, right? So I just want to kind of put that out there. And I think, again, there's a huge other part of the research that is lacking. You want to speak to that?
Yeah.
I think I'd like to open the chat and see whether people are understanding everything or whether you're talking too fast.
Oh, no. Okay.
I think it's a good time to see whether people, so let's go to the chat.
Sure.
Okay. How is everybody tracking? You can go in the chat. JB says good speed.
Okay. So it seems like it's all right. Good from Nemo.
Ham says good. Perfect. Great info.
You're killing it.
Understanding everything. All good.
Okay.
Quitter, quick, but got it. Or quite quick, but got it. I got it. Okay.
I'll try to slow down a little bit. I didn't have any coffee this morning
And
to help you.
Everybody says good, so everybody says good. So
All right.
It's worse if I have coffee. So I have no coffee in me. This is me without coffee. I'll be real clear about that. All right, let's keep going. So I want to talk about hyperaccumulators right now, because we were talking a bit more about plants pulling up chemicals. We're just going back to the plants and chemicals. If you look at a lot of the species under hydrocarbons and VOCs, you'll see a lot of things that are trees and grasses. And what's interesting about that is that with the trees, some of it is like kind of that phyto extraction, but a lot of it is that they create incredible habitats for bacteria. So this is one of those things where it's the actual bacteria that are degrading the contaminant, not necessarily the plant. And it's the same thing with a lot of the grasses and some of the other things like alfalfa and things like that, where you actually have these nitrogen fixers, clover, that are really good at breaking down hydrocarbons, and it's because of the bacteria that they're working with. Same with mulberry. Right? There's a certain plant bacteria kind of combination there, and how the plant creates the right habitat for that bacteria. So again, with all of these things, it's not one or the other. Nature brings it together, and it's good to be kind of cognizant of that when you're kind of creating your remediation ecosystems, right? Now, with hyperaccumulators, we move more into the plants, as I was saying before, that are good at pulling up heavy metals. And this is just a list of some of the hyperaccumulators that have been tested. As I said, with sunflower, you have with lead, you have this big list where people are talking about sunflowers and brown mustard. You see things like water hyacinth, which is a super invasive species. And again, people have done research and said, hey, this is really good at pulling up certain contaminants. But if you introduce that to a damaged environment, you're going to create a lot of kind of found it in other things where it could take over. So again, I would say I'm always against using invasives, completely against it. But I don't know, I put it on there because I was trying to be honest. But there's a lot of different pieces there. again, with lead, the best one that they've been finding is alpine pennycress, like hands down. Arsenic, you see some of the ferns are really good at doing that. And you just can kind of go down the list. And again, this is focused quite on kind of the plants you find in North America, and less so in some other places. So I always encourage people to, if you have access to other research, send it my way, because I would love to make this bigger. And here, again, we're not talking so much about things. They're not being broken down. They're literally being hyper-accumulated into the plant. And then the list keeps going. We got some others here. I don't want to spend too much time on that. I just wanted to kind of put that up there so people could see it. Now, disposal options. So this is the piece where people are like, okay, we use these plants to hyper-accumulate our heavy metal. What do we do with it, right? And there is no good answer. That's why I have that little graphic with the cat and a unicorn, because I'm like, yo, you don't have a plant situation where you pull up a heavy metal, it makes a rainbow, everybody's a wizard, it's a high five. Like, it's like you don't have that. We've inherited complex problems where there isn't this perfect solution. And I think sometimes when we're working with environmental solutions, people want to have that totally good news story, and that's not what we're necessarily dealing with. But when it comes to kind of hyper accumulating and ending up with these plants, what you have to think about is, once you kind of have maybe grown your first round of phytoremediators, hyper accumulators, you need to test the soil to say, hey, did it even work? Because maybe it didn't work. You have to test the plant to say, is it toxic or not? Because it might not have pulled up that much. And if it is at a certain level of toxicity, then what you have to do is figure out what you're going to do with it. And what a lot of people have done in the past is they basically take the heavy metal contaminated plants, they bag them up, and then they actually send them for more of like a toxic disposal to a special landfill. And even though that's not ideal, it's better than what would have happened before, where they would have taken all the soil in that area and took up all the heavy metal soil and then taken all that volume and landfilled it. So you're dealing with a smaller volume of toxicity, but it's still a problem because you're still moving that somewhere off site. So it's not a complete solution. The other thing that people talk about is incineration. But the problem with incineration is that there's a whole bunch of toxicity that comes from that. So that is not necessarily a solution either. There is this idea of keeping it on your site and kind of keeping it in this way where you're not trying to make a sacrifice zone in somebody else's community. You take those plants, those kind of contaminated material, you bring it to a part of your site that you can kind of fence off, that maybe isn't kind of in the path of runoff, and people, children, dogs can't get in there, and you compost that down and kind of make that your sacrifice zone, and find ways to kind of keep immobilizing and working with your kind of toxic matter there. Because again, there's no way to really fix it. There is some things that people have talked about also composting that material down and then using it to, I don't know, like feed to strong, kind of longer lasting plants. So it's kind of like giving that, we even use worms to kind of break it down into smaller and more dense mass, and then giving it to things like trees that you might use for furniture or for fence posts. Because again, you're trying to find a way to bind it at that point. And I mean, there's also this piece with this, and this gets more technological and it's more exciting, where people talk about phytomining, basically using plants and mushrooms to pull up these contaminants, and then through kind of more technological and complex in lab situations, you can actually then kind of remove the metal from that plant and recapture it. And there is work that's been done like that in Japan and in Korea, but that's not something that's accessible to most people. So I don't tend to put it as a solution. But I mean, there might come a time where that is, right? But in the end, there's no real good option. I tend to lean to say to people, like, keep it on your site and find a way to immobilize it and kind of keep track of it. Or, you're just constantly working with it's not ideal. So that also begs the question, again, hyperaccumulation is very sexy to people because they love the idea of using plants and mushrooms to pull things out of the ground. Maybe with metals, we should be working more at immobilization than extraction, right? Depending on what we're dealing with. So a lot of things to think about there. On the topic of any kind of phytoremediation when we're hyperaccumulating, people also need to realize that there's different kinds of metals that react differently. So cationic metals, which is our lead, our cadmium, copper, things like that, they are easier to extract under acidic conditions. So if you're saying, I want to pull this out of my soil, but my soil is really alkaline, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. But then if your soil is really alkaline and you have lead in it, you might want to consider, how available is that lead, right? Like, do I even need to be worried about in certain capacities. So you always have to be kind of being like, what is the acidity and what am I dealing with? On the other side, anionic metals, which are metals, arsenic and chromium, they are easier to extract in more alkaline conditions and become more immobilized and acidic. And what's awkward is we often find sites that have both lead and arsenic. And so what you're doing to help one come out of the soil is immobilizing the other. So you have to almost do it in this stepwise fashion. So it just, there's a way to kind of work with the immobilization and the extraction where maybe you even try to change your pH to kind of get things out. And then you try to shift it back to immobilize what's left, right? Like it's just kind of, again, that constant trying to figure it out. One thing I also wanted to add, I'm jumping a bit into fungi before we're really getting into microremediation, but another piece was just considering, because we're talking about heavy metals, immobilization. That's where, again, you're trying to keep the heavy metal kind of at the root level. You're trying to keep it from moving into your plants or like kind of moving around in the water and things like that. Mycorrhizal fungi has been found to do that in a lot of ways, to kind of hold the metal at the plant root, kind of bound up in the soil. And one thing we can do when we're planting certain plants, in kind of a remediation environment, if we're not trying to extract everything, if we've decided to kind of go for more of an immobilization technique, you can inoculate your plants with mycorrhizal fungi. And again, that's trying to, again, keep the metal from moving up into what you're trying to eat or trying to grow. And mycorrhizal fungi is just good to have in terms of also you're dealing with plants that are in kind of dry, desiccated, drought. They're more prone to disease because the environment's hard. The mycorrhizal fungi give them that added pow. But again, if you're trying to pull up contaminants, you don't want to be working with mycorrhizal. And a lot of our phytoremediators that are really good at pulling things up are brassicas. And they do that because they actually don't have mycorrhizal fungi, right? They just become this like straight up vacuum. So again, just something to consider. Moving back to lead. And again, lead is a huge thing in a lot of our cities in terms of because of the things we painted our houses with, because of leaded gasoline, we find lead in a lot of things. And it's not just those things. It's like, I do a whole other presentation on contaminants and like what they are and where you find what, and you can just take a metal and list all the different things that would bring it to your site, right? Which even if you're in a rural area, you might have lead on your field because it used to be a part of certain pesticides, right? Like it just keeps going, or certain fertilizers. But when we're dealing with lead, again, we always come into that question, are we trying to extract it or immobilize it? And one of the things to think about is lead is not, it's not so much a worry of the lead moving into your plant, it's more of it being on your plant. And so when it rains and it kind of, the lead kind of earth splashes up onto your leaves, or it coats the roots of your plant, or coats your potato or things like that. People are getting lead exposure because they're working in the soil. Children are playing in it, they're touching it, we're tracking it around. Lead is often, the concern is the physical, like we're just like, not it moving in, but moving around. And so from an immobilization standpoint, if you have lead in your soil, you can look at how do you increase the pH to try to immobilize it. Bringing in things like compost, bringing in organic matter, you can immobilize it, I think, up to like 10%, right? Like there's ways to kind of, again, lock it down. Adding phosphorus to the soil will do this interesting reaction where it creates something called lead pyromorphite. And that is an even less bioavailable form of lead. So again, you're trying to bind it in a different form. There was folks doing work like that. I think the EPA was actually running some kind of field tests around using fish bones, ground up fish bones, to actually bring that phosphorus into the soil and kind of create that different kind of compound with lead. So if I was doing something with lead, I would think, how do I immobilize it, work with the pH, add some of these things like phosphorus and organic matter into the soil, and then cover the soil. The other piece is you have to cover it because you do not want people touching it. You don't want it splashing around. And so that's when we start working with things like mulch and sheet mulching and building up, right? But if you don't want to do that, there is that whole idea of extraction. And then you're working with things like alpine pennycrest to hyperaccumulate the lead. So different strokes for different folks. But again, lead is not, I think people get really worried about it, and it's something to be worried about. And when you're working with it, you also have to be wearing gloves and dust masks and things like that. But it's not something that you can't get around and you can't heal and fix. It's also something in permaculture I always find really funny that, you know, this whole permaculture thing of wanting to plant right next to your house because you're trying to maximize your zone zero. But often right next to your house is where you might have some of your heaviest lead contamination, because that's where the paint chips from old paint that had lead in it have been falling. And so just, you know, things to consider. Phytofiltration, another thing that people get very excited about when we're working with plants, is plants' ability in water to intercept water or to pull contaminants out of water. In the left, we have some pictures of floating islands. To the right, we have kind of like the rain garden kind of bioswale idea. And one of the interesting things is there's a whole bunch of different aquatic plants that do incredible work around pulling up contaminants or hyperaccumulating heavy metals. But one of the ways, especially in things like floating islands, that they do most of their work is that they have these incredible root systems, and the root systems kind of create this amazing habitat for biofilm. And so what you're seeing there is actually more of a bacterial kind of degradation that's happening. So again, nothing in isolation. Take a breath. We're in microremediation. I don't know how we're doing on time, but we're kind of in the final stretch. Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. It's 47, so yeah, it all depends on your timing and how long you can stay. So yeah, we're
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try not to talk faster, but still cover it all. So microremediation, people love it. We're working with fungi to break down to break down chemicals, to uptake heavy metals. But one of the things that mushrooms get such an incredible reputation is that they are really good at dealing with some of the really complex chemicals, the pesticides, oil, things like that. Also good at dealing with things like E. coli. So again, to the left, we have oyster mushroom. It's one of the superstars when it comes to breaking a bunch of different chemicals down. Shaggy mane, which is in the bottom left, is really good at dealing with arsenic. The garden giant or Kingstropharia to the right top is really good when it comes to everything from E. coli to, again, different chemicals. And then turkey tail below, again, heavy metals, chemicals, all of that. One of the biggest kind of challenges for people, though, when they're doing microremediation is learning how to cultivate mushrooms and then learning how to keep them alive and sustain them, because that is not everybody's skill set. And it's one that a lot of people are skilling up to learn. And you want to know those people, because again, you can't really have a successful microremediation project if you don't know how to keep your ally alive and kind of, doing what they got to do. When we're talking about microremediation, what we're often working with is saprophytic fungi. And these are the fungi that have kind of, in nature, they break down kind of the woody material, the, leaves, wood, things like that in the forest. And what makes them such good remediators is they look at something like an oil molecule, and it's not that different in terms of some of the composition to cellulose and to lignin. And so they kind of can make that jump and say, okay, I can work with this. Other things to think about with fungi is how they do some of this remediation. With humans, for example, when we eat, we ingest and then we digest. With mushrooms, what they do is they digest, so they send out their enzymes through the mycelium. They kind of send out the enzymes to break down the contaminant, and then they bring it in. So really neat kind of magic there. It's why people kind of fall in love with them, I think, in a lot of ways. But they are really, really good when it comes to, again, dealing with your more complex chemicals. I'm not going to go into this too much. It's really important to understand the life cycle of fungi. When we're dealing with remediation, what we're really kind of trying to bring into the environment is not mushrooms in terms of mushroom, kind of the ones you can pick up and go, move around. We're working with mycelium. We're working with kind of, to me, it's like mycelium is like the body. It would be the body of the tree, whereas the mushroom is the apple, right? And so we're trying to work with kind of the vegetative body, the mycelium, and get it running, get it kind of in our filters in kind of different places to do that thing I was talking about in terms of the digestion and the ingestion and the breaking down of different things. So you can kind of see that white matter is your mycelium that you're working with. And again, we don't have time to hit this at all, but you want to do a microcultivation course. You want to learn how to cultivate them, or at least how to work with, spawn and bring it onto your site, because you need that. And at the bottom, those are just 2 bags of kind of myceliated spawn.
Just giving a plug for our mutual friend, Jay Schindler, Fungi for the People here.
Oh my God, I love Jay.
Excellent.
Yes.
I've taken his 5-day cultivation course, and he does a micro remediation course, and he's amazing. And I know you wrote part of the book at his house and stuff. So yeah, he's the one who first told me about you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's great. He's great. So yeah, finding those people in your area who do micro cultivation. And you can either become that person, or you just have to, again, create that relationship and bring them onto your team. In terms of some of the different things, as I mentioned, this is just a list. It's not a comprehensive list, but as you see, things like shaggy mane are really good at hyperaccumulating some of the metals. The different oysters, they have everything from PCBs to PAHs to some of the heavy metals as well. Shiitake see the kind of the chemicals that it can do. And when we're working again with even things like mycofiltration, like using mushrooms to intercept contaminated water, we can kind of use a bunch of these mushrooms, not all together in the same thing, but we can stage it so that you're kind of dealing with a bunch of different capabilities for remediation. So mycofiltration, just a quick plug. Yes, Tim?
No, keep going.
No, you good? Okay. Mycofiltration, one of the things that people get very excited about with microremediation is the ability for mushrooms to kind of filter contamination. And it's because the mycelium, it's just, if you look at it, that's kind of mycelium under, kind of blown up under a microscope, but it is this tight web and this natural kind of filter material that kind of catches the things moving through it and then can go through that extra phase of actually breaking it down. So that's something that, is a beautiful thing to work with. And when we're talking about things like mycoswales and bunker spawn, bunker bags, that is kind of what's happening at a very, kind of drilled down kind of place. So when we're talking about mycofiltration, these are just a few examples. People can do these things where they take, they basically inoculate bags that are burlap or whatnot with different things for the mushrooms to live on and eat. We call it the substrate. You basically take, mushroom spawn, you inoculate these bunker bags, and you put them in the path of your contaminated water. And so what you're trying to do, and you see in these pictures, is that you're trying to put them in a way that the water is going to move through them and allow for some of that kind of filtration aspect to happen. And again, you can do one set of bags that are turkey tail, a bit below that you could do shiitake, a bit below that you could do oyster, and you would be then kind of using kind of like the whole thing in terms of different fungi also have different kind of weaves in terms of their tightness of filter. So you can kind of play with that. You can play with their different capacities. You can also not do the bag and actually just do a mycoswale where you inoculate the wood chips and kind of do it in a swale form. But the piece with this is that you can't just make this and throw it into the landscape and expect it to do its work. It actually has to be a like complete developed mycofilter in order for it to work. So that can take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. And so often we find when people are like, oh, I want to do mycofiltration. I've just had a wildfire. Let me put this out into the environment. They need to actually have these mycofilters already. They need to be completely myceliated because otherwise you don't get a filter. You just have a bag full of wood chips and chunks of spawn and the water goes right through it, right? Or it doesn't actually have the ability to do what it needs to do. So we need to actually pre-position our resources and have people who have this on hand so that when we need them, we can kind of pull them out and be like, boom, I have my filter. And that's something that folks don't always have. But I mean, if you have a bunch of these sitting around, you can also, use them in your garden. If it doesn't have a disaster, you can like sell them. There's a lot of different pieces there, but knowing people who like to stockpile bunker bags, those are good friends to have. So I'm a big fan of that. One quick story with this is a woman that I was interviewing her name is Jess Rubin. And she's up in Vermont. She was doing some experiments because they were dealing with at, Lake Champlain near Burlington. They have this whole issue with all this runoff going into the lake and eutrophication, like too much like nitrogen, phosphorus, and that creating all these problems in the lake. And some of that comes from the dairy industry and some of the farming around there. And so she was kind of wanting to see how microremediation can make a difference. And folks like Paul Stamets have documented that as being, he used King Staphyria to do stuff around E. coli and farm runoff. And so Jess wanted to kind of give that a try. And she was doing greenhouse experiments to kind of answer a bunch of questions about, how many times you have to like switch this out, or what happens when it floods, when it freezes, like, is this actually reducing E. coli? She was testing all these different things, which is beautiful, kind of coming at it from that citizen science mindset. And one of the things that she found was that yes, the King Staphyria did break down or kind of drop down the E. coli, but it also was releasing phosphorus, which is not the best thing if you're already dealing with an environment where you have too much phosphorus going into the water and creating this kind of eutrophication. And it doesn't mean people shouldn't be doing this. In her mind, she was like, okay, so this is phosphorus is a bit of a byproduct, but if we do these mycoswales and then work with kind of plants kind of towards kind of the tail end of our filter system to pull up the phosphorus and to grow, then we're kind of making a problem a solution, right? And so she was just kind of opening up to being like, it's not just about the mushrooms. How do we bring in the plants to deal with this? And also working not just with King Staphyria. She actually found that there was some other mushrooms she wanted to work with that had different tightnesses of filter. that she could also bring in. So she was really excited about this polyculture idea. And I just wanted to share that because it was something that I wasn't aware of. And I was excited that she's doing that research. And that's actually kind of a picture of some of the work that she was doing in terms of the greenhouse and kind of trying to figure out how do you actually use the mushrooms to do this in the best way possible. Now, I want to talk briefly about fire because you guys are in California. And I also I'm from Alberta and British Columbia in Canada, and that's also a huge thing up there. When we're dealing with fire, again, it's important, like anytime you do remediation, you want to start by understanding what are the source of my contaminants, and then what is the contaminant, and how is it moving in the landscape. So in a fire kind of situation where you're going through like towns and things like that, and you have burnt buildings, you're dealing with heavy metals, you're dealing with dioxin, which is a persistent organic pollutant, you're dealing with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PCBs, and then also really high pH because of the ash, right? And all of these are things that people should not be around, but also you do not want to get in your water. And often flood follows fire. That's just kind of the nature of the disaster game, especially when you have late season fires in a place like California and then the rainy season comes. And you don't always have a big enough time in between them to say, okay, now I'm going to spend 6 to 8 weeks getting my bunker spawn ready, right? Because again, rain events, you also have mudslides that can move things around. And then there's just the normal like soil and wind erosion. So this is something that, again, a lot of people have been kind of concerned about. In Sonoma County, after the Tubbs fire, folks there actually did bioremediation and did that kind of response. And it's not something I've seen a lot of other communities do, and it's exciting. And I'm not the best person to talk about that because I wasn't physically there, but it was really neat to watch from afar and say, this is a community that has the people in it who know how to do microremediation, who know how to do composting, and they're getting out there and trying to actually address this, right? So super interesting stuff. But just even a few things to consider when you're doing any kind of remediation post-fire, you have to think about, okay, how am I going to remove certain toxic ash and debris? You have to figure out what are the key points to intercept your contamination. You know, is there a way where it's like it's all going this way or that way, or you want to make sure it doesn't get to this body of water? Where's your interception points? And then you kind of have to figure out how you intercept that water using remediation installations. So is that bunker spawn? Is that making micro swales? Is it inoculating straw wattles, which they often use post-fire with erosion? Is it actually having those already inoculated with mycelium so that it even is a better filter, right? Because if it's just the straw, it's just a regular filter. It's a physical block. But if you have the mycelium, now you're not just physically blocking all this kind of ash and stuff going through, you're actually dealing with the hyperaccumulation and the breakdown of certain chemicals, right? And that's one thing. And one way to go, if you're just dealing with soil, you're going to have to also look at plants and bacteria. If you're not so much dealing with the water side of things, it's like, what are we doing with certain plants to break it down, or composting or compost tea that we're applying. And then you have to test and monitor, right? You have to be like, is what I'm doing actually working? And this is the kind of thing that you'll have to do for a while to see if it works. Mm-hmm. But it's not out of the realm of doable. It just takes people being prepared. And so it's something that I want to see more people try to do post-fire. And it's not going to always be the people in that place who are doing it because their lives have been upended. But I think it's something that people in neighboring communities can also have on hand and be able to offer as a response if possible. I'm gonna briefly mention this, but we're running out of time. But there's a project I always like to highlight. One of the things I like to talk about with remediation is, again, you have to bring together everything. It's not just the mushrooms, it's the plants, it's the bacteria, and the fungi. And a really amazing project is this project in Ecuador called Amisacho. And it's amazing. I love the people who are part of it. And it is also kind of in partnership with Co-Renewal, who are based out of California. And the woman on the right, her name is Lexi. And she is an incredible example of someone who, I met her, she was taking a remediation, microcultivation course that a bunch of us were teaching about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And she took the class and then ended up going down to Ecuador and then jumpstarting and kind of reviving this incredible project in Ecuador, and is still doing that today. And so that's just that kind of plug to be like, you can skill up and then take this to that next level and start doing beautiful work for the land. But this whole project is to deal with the fact that in a certain part of the Amazon in Ecuador, you had these oil giants leave behind these toxic ponds of oil. And in that area, you have some of the highest rates of cancer and birth defects for the indigenous people and the farmers in the area, because every time it rains, that stuff floods over. It's getting into everything. And they've been fighting a battle. The indigenous people in that area and the local folks have been fighting a battle for decades for the company to do the right thing. And kind of while that's been going on, there's been other folks from kind of Co-Renewal and Amisacho who've been kind of looking at how do we try to remediate these toxic oil pits? What can we do? And they initially started kind of looking at mushrooms and also bringing in bacteria. And one of the things that Lexi did when she kind of arrived is she started teaching microcultivation and kind of remediation courses with local folks, because also trying to embed those skills locally so it's not outsiders always coming in. And also really working with local knowledge. She also built a myco kind of cultivation lab, which is amazing, because that's a place here we have something where we're like, oh, I need spawn. I'm going to go ask some myco mushroom cultivator in the city to get it. When you're in the Amazon in Ecuador, you don't necessarily have those same access. So you got to do that internally. You got to build up the capacity of that region. So she did that. And then one thing they started doing that's fascinating is they were looking at the oil pits and looking for what species were growing there. Because instead of taking that one size fits all saying, I read that oyster mushrooms do this, they were like, what is already here? And is it a species that is just tolerant to the oil, or is it nature's solution for breaking it down? And so they started kind of collecting what mushrooms were showing up, looking at whether they can actually cultivate it and kind of expand it and see if it's something they can use to break down oil. Because the best solution you will ever have will be your most local solution in terms of its ability to do the job and be hardy. And so that's one of the things they've been doing. They've also been kind of working at, like, again, training mycelium. So this is the thing that's amazing with mushrooms, that you can actually find strains of mushrooms that are more likely to break down your contaminant and even kind of steer that a little bit. So they've been working to that effect. And then they've been looking at doing a pilot project on the bacterial remediation side of taking this oil contaminated soil and using petrophilic bacteria and kind of composting methods to break it down. And so that's all these different things they're working with. They're also working with the local kind of community organizing environmental justice group to put on bioremediation courses and trainings. And that's kind of coming up. So it's a really amazing project. But again, looking at not just using mycology, but using bacteria and a bunch of different pieces to actually fix it. So yes, sir.
I just wondered, did Lexi send a invoice to the polluter?
That is, so the community has been fighting that legally for so long. And again, it's like law, I don't know personally where that's at. I think it's been a really uphill battle. And when we go into legal fights with companies, multi-million-dollar companies, they will try to literally just wait you out in court. That's what we've seen with a lot of the oil spill companies. They will just wait and they just hope that they can outspend you and outweigh you. And so that's why it's like, I mean, ideally you want these guys to be paying for that, but you're going to be waiting decades. And I think that's why people are like, how do we get in there and start trying to do this in the interim? And I also want to plug that project. If anyone is on this webinar who has funding, they are a project that is doing such amazing work with the community. And in any kind of remediation project, you just need funding to kind of take it to the next level. So they are always in need of that. And I will connect you because I want them to rock because they're incredible. Yes.
But Leila, I think they need to calculate and just record all of their costs, and at the end just send the bill to the polluter, even if it's just a gesture. I mean, make sure that it's publicly done so that they know, that everybody knows, the world must know.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. And I will share that with Lexi. Final, we're in like the last slide. Quick plug with remediation. This can be toxic work. If you're doing toxic work, you got to take care of yourself. And so I always want to say to people, like, wear the right gear. If you're responding to an oil spill, you want to have a respirator. You want to think about the fact that the first 12 hours of a spill is where you have all the VOCs in the air in the highest kind of concentrations. And so you're just taking that in. And so you want to be wearing respirators. You want to be wearing kind of those sexy suits you see in that picture there, like Tyvek didn't, it's a good thing if you're in certain situations. You wouldn't necessarily wear that if you're dealing with lead, but if you're dealing with oil contamination, the thing I hate the most is when there's oil spills, and I have friends on Facebook who do that kind of disaster porn where you see them with their hand in the oil and they're like, look at me, I'm an oiled bird. You are just hurting yourself when you do that. And so again, wear the proper gear. You know, if you're doing things like dealing with heavy metals in soil and lead soil, it's like you want to wear a dust mask. You want to change your clothes, you know? These are just kind of common sense things. Even things like taking a hot shower versus a cold shower after you're working with contamination. Hot shower opens up your pores. You don't want that if you're dealing with contamination. So you want to take a cold shower, right? You want to maybe even design a place on your site to do decontamination, and do some kind of weird like shower thing on your site with like a little mushroom bin below, like whatever. But it's something to think about. Your health is so important, and you can only do this work for as long as you want to do it if you are healthy. The other beautiful thing is, as a lot of these plants and mushrooms heal the earth, they also can heal us. And so one of the things that Ami Sacho has been doing is actually doing mycomedicinal courses. And part of teaching and sharing some of that mycocultivation work with like women's cooperatives and things like that in Ecuador is to also give folks who are dealing with cancer and all these terrible illnesses that come from oil contamination some of the very tools to also help support them in their physical health. So we know that a lot of the mushrooms are really good at dealing with cancer. Things like turkey tail, things like maitake, really good for that. And so again, knowing how to grow those things and not using your mushrooms you're using in the remediation site to heal yourself, but actually having another source to actually make tinctures and do that work for yourself. Reishi, which is in the upper left, again, really good for things like cancer, also really good for hypersensitivity. People who have a lot of exposure to chemicals can become hypersensitive, and reishi is one of those mushroom allies that has been kind of found to kind of chill that out a little bit. Things like cilantro is a really good kind of plant when you're dealing with heavy metals and kind of moving that out of your system. Milk thistle, incredible when it comes to your liver. And anyone who's around a lot of toxins, it's like their liver's taking a hit, right? Same thing with dandelion, supportive of the liver. Lion's mane, which is that mushroom in the upper right corner, really, really good for things like central nervous system and kind of brain stuff. And one of the things that we were seeing post BP Gulf Horizon spill, when they were using a lot of dispersants on people, when not on people, sorry, they were using dispersants on the oil, but people were getting exposed to it. When you have dispersant plus oil in salt water, it creates another chemical compound that actually will eat away at your central nervous system. And then people have all these physical impacts from that. So again, what are some of the natural allies that you can be working with to support yourself as you do this work, or even offer up into communities where people are exposed to this? So that is it. That was a bit of a marathon. I am done. Now I'm going to go take a nap. That could be John and Tim on the questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, we got 3 in the Q&A, and I know John's got some he's been writing. John, let's go with one. What do you want to talk about, John?
Well, I have two main things.
Can you unshare? We leave it up for a little bit so people can write that. That's good.
I have 15.
Oh yeah, that's my email. That's my email. You can email me if you're working on a project. I'll try to get back to you. My life is hectic right now, but that's my email. And then my website is not updated because I've been busy, so don't judge me for that. I'm gonna put that out.
Great. And then leave it up for just a second, and then unshare so we can see your face big too when we chat here.
Oh,
leave it there.
Okay.
Leave it there for a minute.
But I have a number of questions, but I'm just going to ask you 2. One, how do you stay so happy when you're dealing with a really serious question? That's the first one. And the second one is, how many people have dedicated their lives to doing this? Is it a big fraternity or sorority, or is it a small group of people?
I'll answer that question first. I think there's a lot of people doing this work in different ways. Like, I think you see there's people, like there's the researchers, and I think there's a lot of that. In terms of the actual kind of like grassroots, kind of like community level remediators, I think there's not enough, and there could be more. I know when I went to write my book, and that was back in 2012, 2013, it was hard to find people. But it was also because people weren't necessarily connected to each other. And what I found interesting is, like, every year since, because of the work of some people who've been doing incredible jobs teaching, the folks who've been organizing different like mycology conferences too, it's like you're starting to see more people doing this work, right? And I think that's really, really important. Again, I think it needs to be bigger. And I'm only speaking for North America because I am not as familiar with the movements in Asia and in Europe and Australia. But I have seen over the last bunch of years, more people knowing about this and more people getting excited about it, that hasn't necessarily translated into more remediation projects, which is sad.
Is it hundreds of people, or is it thousands of people, or is it even more?
I don't know. I actually can't answer that question.
Okay.
I mean, I know that I maybe have 100 friends who do it, but that's not like, there could be more people, you know? And again, it's like, who's doing what? Are you counting like, you know, who are the main like folks who are doing mycology, right? And doing the microremediation pieces, the microcultivation pieces. And even within the cultivator folks, I know a lot of people who are kind of cultivating mushrooms and excited about microremediation, but I don't see them necessarily doing projects yet, right? And I think a lot of times people are just, they need to be called in. They need to have, you know, the right kind of opportunities. Funding is an issue. There's a lot of things, but I think that knowledge is developing and people are trying it out. And hopefully now, people were trying it out, you know, in the 90s and 2000s. Hopefully now that there's more books and more courses out about it, people are doing it better. That's the one thing. Because I know when I went to write this book, I'd heard about it in a few different permaculture courses where people would say mushrooms can do this, plants can do that. And then if you were like, okay, how? Let's dive deeper. Let's talk about how you physically do it. There wasn't that many opportunities to learn that or to apprentice with that. And I think we need more of those.
Okay.
You know, like
How
I taught a
stay
course.
happy?
How am I?
Unshare your screen for this. Let's see you. Unshare your screen. And then answer.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Stop share.
There we go.
Okay. Did that work?
Yeah.
So wait, how am I what?
How do you stay happy? You seem so happy.
I have a creepy thing where I smile whether I'm happy or sad. Like I have to be angry to frown. And so sometimes I've gotten into trouble where I'm talking about oil spills to a community and I'm smiling the whole time and they think I'm terrifying. But I think it's also, to me, I think in any kind of disaster, I mean, we've inherited this, so you got to figure it out. And I think I get sad when I don't feel like I have choices and I don't have options. And as long as I have options and there's something else I could be doing, I think that keeps me going. And so I think that's why for me, it's like, if I haven't exhausted my options, if I haven't gone to the end of everything, I can't give up on it. And I think with a lot of this work, we can say this is a really overwhelming situation. And I think the way to kind of rise above it is to say, what do we do? How do we mobilize? How do we kind of apply ourselves to fix it? And there's a mix of kind of curiosity, but also like obligation in terms of like a sacred obligation to do the work. And I think I'm just a bit of a disaster junkie and I'm kind of fueled by chaos. So there's that. I'll just own that. I'll just straight up own that. And I come from Alberta, which is just toxic. So you just have to get with it. You have to be like, that's real. And then start doing stuff about it, right?
The only thing I know about this is I spent many years as an international journalist, and rushing to terrorist activity or this kind of stuff had this energizing situation, but it was very chaotic and confusing, not really satisfying. But let's go to the questions that people have had.
All right, great. We got Benjamin says, I think humor is tied close with grief. I think laughing and crying are ambiguous emotions to a degree. Keep smiling.
No, he's right, though. It's like humor and grief are very similar. And I feel like humor is a way to alchemize the grief somehow. You're trying to burn it off a little bit and keep it so that's something that people can keep working in, right? Because again, I have friends who live in communities where people, like, they know their family members are dying of cancer because the water's toxic. And how do they keep going when that's all around you? And in those communities, I see weird, dark humor, because again, they can't, like, the option of letting that take you over that doesn't lead you anywhere necessarily that you can work with. And so, I mean, we all have, I think everybody has their own ways of handling what we've inherited, the future, the bad news and everything. And I think to each their own. I'm a creepy smiler. Other people look mysterious and deep. It's just, everybody's got their own way.
All right, great. Yeah. We'll get to these questions now. And we're getting a lot of good feedback. Everybody really liked that presentation.
Great.
And then, someone's asking, we'll get to the questions over here, but someone's asking if you do teach courses on this.
Yeah, I do. I used to a lot more. Like after the book, I actually did a lot of like teaching and touring. And one of my favorite things is I taught like a 3-month intensive because I also think the thing with this information is we still just skimmed it, right? And it also can be overwhelming to people where they come out and they're like, that's cool, but they don't actually know how to do it if you just talk at them. And so I kind of developed a curriculum and taught like a 3-month course when I was in Vancouver in Canada. And that was one of my favorite things to do, just in terms of the depth and actually feeling like you really were letting people out with like more embedded skills and more kind of body memory and more complexity of kind of understanding. I haven't done that in a while because my life is just taking me in different directions. I teach, I mean, I was just in Santa Barbara a couple of weeks ago teaching a class. And if anybody ever wants me to come to their community and teach, as long as you can cover me getting there, I'm down. I'm working a job right now that's really stressful in terms of disasters. And so it's been kind of like, I don't necessarily have the flexibility I used to have, but I always am up to teach. I like teaching.
Great.
And again, it's everything from a 3-hour thing or a 1-hour thing to like a weekend or like a longer kind of setting.
All right. Well, let's get to some of these questions here. We got some good questions here. So Adam Hicks asks, and by the way, if anybody wants to ask your question yourself, you can just let me know that. And I'll bring it up. Adam Hicks says, I'm working on 70 acres of former pineapple lands, which received heavy metals and toxins from fertilizers, pesticides slash herbicides. And you can see these in the Q&A too there, Leila, as well as burnt piping and weed mat. Heptachlor, arsenic, lead, and mercury are the primary ones suggested to be aware of so far. Question 1, which laboratory do you recommend to do testing for these metal and chemical residues? And question 2, these were recommended to check, but how do you know there aren't others present without testing for everything, quote unquote? And then question 3, for the heptachlor, arsenic, lead, and mercury mentioned, do you have a perspective on which bioremediation method you'd recommend?
Oh, wow. That's okay. I would just say, I think Adam, you need to email me. Cause that's big. That's a lot in terms of, covering all of that. So I actually would really like to follow up with you and kind of have a conversation around that a bit more. Where pineapple. So it's like, where are you? I don't know where is he? Is it Hawaii? Is this Hawaii?
Maui. Yeah. Maui.
Okay. Cause I remember someone was on from Hawaii. Cause I was like, you don't have pineapples in Canada. I'm also terribly allergic to pineapples. So I'm like, I think, the thing with the soil labs is that, and the testing is that's very specific to where you are. Like different places have different people testing. One of the best things is if you have access to like a university that's willing to work with you, you can get that for a lot cheaper. And so if you have a university that has the capabilities of doing that, that's a kind of a good kind of partnership to reach out to. Otherwise, it's just reaching out to the different soil labs in your area and saying, hey, like, what's your prices? Let them know what you're trying to do. See if you can get a discount. Because I don't know who in Hawaii. That's not, I actually don't know who you would reach out to, but I'm sure there's people there who can do that. And if there's any kind of like university or agricultural extension or something like that, that's also a good place to ask. I think one of the things I say to people is that if you don't have the money to test everything, because it's like it costs you to test different things. Although you kind of get packages for different contaminants, but if you kind of know what's been on your site and what it would likely lead to, you know you're dealing with those things. And you can kind of hit that. If you do have the ability to do 1 or 2 tests where you can see if there's anything else present, that helps because then you kind of have a bigger understanding what you're dealing with. But even what you mentioned is a lot in terms of like the heavy metals that you're working with and some of the chemicals. And then when it comes to a remediation response, it's also, is it spread out throughout your whole site? Is there some areas that have one more than the other? I think that's also a piece of understanding where the contamination is. And are there all of those in kind of distributed, or is there one area that's more of your heavy metals and one area that's more of the chemicals you mentioned? I think that's all part of like figuring out your project and then figuring out the plants that you would use or the mushrooms or the bacteria, depending on what you're working with. And again, I think it would depend on how much, like what the concentrations are, what your landscape is like. I mean, you're lucky you are in a place where phytoremediation will do real well. Like Hawaii is like, things will grow and they will grow beautifully. I I'd like to talk to you more about that, because that's a lot of detail in terms of like drilling down into it. And I can't even remember all the metals that you mentioned. It was mercury, it was arsenic.
By the way, you can look at the questions yourself. Also, you can, in the Q&A box, the little thing says Q&A.
Q&A.
So you can read along. Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Yeah. Heptachlor, arsenic.
But yeah, we can move on.
And again, yeah, but I want to just seriously send me an email. Because again, arsenic and lead are going to respond differently in terms of what you're doing. So I'd like to work with you on that and just like come up with something. So
awesome. Well, email it. And then, and like I said, you can look along on these questions so you can follow along yourself. Yeah. Benjamin Jansen asks, Benjamin likes to talk. You can talk, Benjamin. How is hydrology, transpiration, or large-scale earth organ functions like biotic pumps affected by immobilization techniques? For example, would a very secure, immobilized, dangerous material spread throughout a substantial area in the soil in tiny grains affect the drainage rate or water holding capacity of a soil? Hi, Benjamin.
Hello.
Hey. Look at your face. That's a great question. I think the one thing with immobilization I want to be really clear about is that it's one of those things that it's never like when it's like even a very secured immobilization, it's like you are constantly having to kind of like watch that, right? And I think some things, the more volatile your landscape is, the more, like, for example, if you immobilize something and you have like a flood or like a lot of water moving through it, that's going to be diluting things and kind of shaking things up. And so that's going to be something you have to kind of keep tracking and keep kind of working on maintaining, right? So I think that's a piece there. Transpiration, I'm not as sure about that. But okay. I definitely think one thing people always have to remember with immobilization is that it's not forever. It's something that we have to kind of keep going forever. And again, in a landscape where things are more stable and there's less kind of forces moving through, immobilization will be left more kind of to do its thing. Whereas if there is a lot of stuff moving through your landscape, whether it's water or fire or things like that, then you have to kind of keep an eye on it, right? And maybe also build in some kind of backup and some redundancy.
Holy shnikes. Complex.
Shnikes, for real. Yep.
While we got you up here, go ahead and ask your question about the ammunition factory.
Ooh. Yeah, here in Auburn in World War II, there was an ammunition factory, and apparently, I'm guessing it's gunpowder that is contaminated on the area. Anything briefly come to mind when dealing with gunpowder?
Mm-hmm. I always have to remember this because I have a whole list of like when you're dealing with ammunitions, when you're dealing with any kind of like military land where they were doing like exercise and stuff like that. Yeah, you're dealing with gunpowder. You're dealing with like the casings. Like lead is a definite thing. Lead, explosives. And then there's going to be, if it was a factory, there's going to be a bunch of chemicals involved. But you're definitely heavy metals. Like I can send me an email and I'll send you the list of kind of the different pieces that you have to work with. And there's been some interesting kind of phytoremediation projects more in like a government level of kind of that, of dealing with that.
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
There was a fun.
No, go ahead.
There was a fun second question on there. I heard about remediation efforts going the other way when it was spores spreading into the atmosphere and spreading a toxin. I forget if it was radioactive, to the point where they had to have people search for mushrooms in the sexy suits to make sure, so basically they spread it. That sounds like a mycological, literacy thing first. But do you have any horror stories like that?
No, and I'm actually fascinated by what did that. But again, I think it's that piece with that do no harm. Because this is quite experimental in some ways, people will make mistakes, but it's like try not to make them at massive scales, And again, it's like you try to work with species and with things that people have already tested and that have been proven before you move to things that no one's really worked with. And you definitely try to avoid invasives at all costs, in my mind. But I'm actually intrigued by what you just said, because I've not heard about that. Yeah. So I'd like to. But even some, like, you have to worry about some of the mushroom species that are parasitic, right? And so it's like, you know, in any of those things, it's like, what are we bringing into the environment? And just because someone did one study that said in a lab, a completely contained lab said this is good at doing this, you're bringing in something that actually might completely start breaking things down, throwing things out of whack, and not just your contaminant. So I think, again, that's always this kind of conscious. And when you're working in, you know, a degraded, like inner, you know, it's like a city landscape, it's concrete, it's like an old, like rubble field. There's a lot different considerations than when you were deciding to do something kind of bordering wildlands or in a more kind of wild environment, right? Like that's something that I've always kind of seen. And I mean, my horror stories, most of them are watching people just do really dumb things with remediation that didn't work. And then saying it did work when it didn't. Those are most of the ones that I have.
Uh-huh.
John, what you got, John?
I'm just wondering whether you think that ecosystem restoration camps would be a good place to teach this kind of understanding, so that both the risks and the and the benefits of doing this kind of work could be spread to more people. And also, what do you think about this concept of collective intelligence, that somehow we need to let all the brains consider these problems because we don't know where the answers will come from?
I mean, yeah, it sounds good to me. And I think we also have to move away from, like, one of the things I've really loved about watching some of the kind of the grassroots, more like micro cultivators and remediators, is that some of the people who are doing incredible work, they taught themselves. They experimented, taught themselves in their backyard or in their basement. And from those people, you're seeing incredible things. And so I think, you know, we have to really redefine who the experts are. We have to really kind of let multiple minds kind of crunch on things. Because again, if you just have a mushroom person trying to group down on a problem, but they're not talking to someone who's a plant person or who's a health person or who understands hydrology, if you don't have all these things kind of mixing, you're really missing out on the bigger picture, and they really inform each other. And so the more diverse our ecosystems are, the more resilient they are, the more diverse our kind of communities of problem solvers and change makers are, it's going to be that same thing. And so I definitely agree with that. I do think one thing we always have to worry about is that any of these kind of conversations, you need to have people who actually are rooted in the land and do that kind of work, because it can get really cerebral with people who've never even tried the thing. And then people start talking about all these things and it's not rooted in reality. So you want to definitely have a mix of people. The first thing you said with I think if you're teaching kind of restoration, if you have people gathering for that, you do want to be also teaching remediation and the complexity of it, because I think you need to kind of, even in remediation, for example, if people know how to deal with contamination, but then the restoration piece, they don't quite know how to do, then you've almost taken it to so far and then you're kind of stuck in succession. You don't know how to move it on. And so I think we want to have that kind of more holistic thinking about it, and also bringing some of that mindset and some of the, I think, the skills that you have in those restoration folks to bear on the remediation problems. Like, I think it's like a win-win, pretty much.
Right.
Decompartmentalize.
Yes.
Thanks, Benjamin. I'm going to stop your video, and you'll still be like we did last time. Here you go.
Yep. Thank you.
Cheers, brother. Let me make sure he's... oh, yeah. And good. All right. Our next question is from Caitlin Lewis. Speaking of grassroots effort and community and collective intelligence and all. So Leila, learning so much from this webinar. Thank you. Really interested in the community/grassroots aspect of your work. How do you find sites to work on with communities? Is it public or private land? Any tips for overcoming barriers? Much appreciated.
It's a great question. I think, the stuff that I have kind of supported have often been people reaching out to me and saying, hey, can you come in? We've just had an oil spill. Or I did like a kind of a tour in North Dakota involving kind of like fracking pollution and kind of going to some of the different indigenous communities there and kind of engaging. And again, all the ones that I've been a part of have been by invite. People have said, I actually want you to come in. I want to talk to you about this. Or other things I've done is where people just reach out to me and they're working on a project and they want kind of advice or they want someone to bounce ideas off. And I enjoy that because I'm like, they're doing their thing with their community and they're just kind of running things by you. I think I think there's a lot of different ways to kind of work with community. I think you have to work with integrity and you have to work respectfully. And I mean, the best is, again, if you're kind of going into community that's not yours, you've been invited by the right people. I think finding sites, private land, if you are in good relation with the person whose land it is, or it's your land, will give you the most freedom to kind of do what you want to do. When you're working with public land, you're dealing with then you have to deal with government, right? And then there's regulations and things like that. That can be challenging, or I mean, really what it forces you to do is have to really do your community engagement work and engage all the stakeholders and players and educate them, and kind of, you maybe move a bit slower, but you actually maybe end up with things that are, again, in the commons, which is what we want to see. So I think it really depends where you are too. Like there's some communities that doing it on public land would be fairly easy because, the government's tapped out and they don't care. Like they're just like, go do it. You know what I mean? Other places, good luck. Or you'll do it on public land and then they'll take it away from you eventually and build a condo on it. Like there's just all these different things. I've also seen people kind of work with developers to say, can I remediate this app, this abandoned lot? And because the developer isn't ready to do anything on it, or the land is not deemed fit, they say, go have it for a couple years. These folks build a beautiful garden, a beautiful remediated healed space. And then the developer says, awesome, I'm going to build a condo. It's just kind of always figuring out who you're working with and the different partners. But it really depends on personal relationships. And if you can, I know some people working with different farmers, where they're trying to deal with intercepting agricultural waste or stuff like that. It's you have good relationship with those folks and you say, this is what I'm going to do. You can do incredible kind of remediation installations. Whereas if you were trying to do that in a national park or on government land, they're going to block you more because they're suspicious and they need certain assurances and all that stuff. So it just really depends. There are places though where you've had municipal governments or county governments reach out to people and say, I want you to help me with this. Or you've had festivals say, hey, can you help us do a microremediation installation? I think it just really depends on where you are. I don't know if that answers the question. I can't see the question anymore.
Oh, it's over and answered. You can click on, there's 3 tabs, open, answered, and dismissed. You can still see every question.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they don't go away. They stay with us.
Okay.
This helps us organize. But yeah, I think that was good. Daryl Anderson, it's not really a question, but he has a couple comments. The one is excellent knowledge to be taught at ecosystem restoration camps fits well with soil building and the emphasis on diversity in permaculture. And then he also says, common problem here is
Where's here?
Yeah, that's what he's in Arkansas.
Aha.
Common problem here is herbiciding of the power lines, especially if there are trees. Historically, lots of wooded land gets aerial herbicide for conversion to pasture. Forest Service uses herbicides to prep land for loblolly plantings. Yeah.
Yeah, that's real.
Yeah, that's real.
Yep. I mean, that's something there's a lot of herbicides in forests. A lot of that.
Okay, well, Caitlin, from the last question, she says, thanks, Leila. It did answer it. If you are ever passing through Ireland, hope to do a course with you.
Oh my God, please invite me to Ireland. Yes. Okay. I went there when I was 13 and it was my first drink I ever had in my life.
Ha!
I love Guinness.
Ireland, get a course together. Great.
13.
All right. Well, Greg Amaru, he has 2 things. One, he says, I would like to suggest John Todd's recent book, which I just so happens to be keeping the camera not at an angle. So he's talking about Healing Earth, an ecologist's journey of innovation and environmental stewardship, which I happen to be reading right now. So there you go. And then we'll get to his question.
And John Todd, I was very inspired by him when I was learning about remediation in terms of his biomachines and his water work. I mean, that is one of the pioneers of this stuff for sure. Yeah.
And then his question is, what are you working on? He says, Leila, are you working on a specific remediation project these days?
Not at the moment, because I'm in New Orleans and I'm doing kind of disaster and emergency management stuff. So I'm getting sucked in more to hurricane stuff and whatever. And I've been doing a bit of support work with Amisacho, but more on trying to get them funding and things like that. And I was advising a few people in their projects, but at the actual moment, I'm not Always down to, but just right now in my life, no. Mm-mm.
Right. Busy. All right.
Yes.
Stephen Zwick, he has a question. First, he has a nice quote. Speaking of how do you stay happy and all that and that whole thing. From Khalil Gibran. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain.
Khalil Gibran is actually my favorite poet. It was my grandma's favorite poet because I'm Arab, and I love Khalil Gibran. I love the Prophet. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Well, Stephen Zwick also asks, remediation and eating mushrooms, safe?
No, I don't think so. I don't know. It depends on what you're working with. It depends because it depends on I would test them if you're dealing with certain chemicals because they have this way of kind of breaking down the chemical and like a hydrocarbon, for example, and then rearranging it into like a complex sugar, right? That's something that people have talked about. But it's like if there's heavy metals present, there's a lot of things where I wouldn't eat the mushrooms on the things that I was remediating. Just for safety, especially if there's heavy metals or other chemicals that didn't quite break down the way you want them to, I think it's always better to kind of like have your clean kind of mushrooms that you're growing for food and medicine and use the spent spawn. Because when you're growing mushrooms, you have it's the mycelium. And then from there, you get the fruity, which is the mushrooms. And so you can be kind of harvesting your mushrooms from like your cultivation piece where you're kind of have your mycelium and then taking that mycelium and those kind of spent blocks and using that for your remediation. But I'd be eating the mushrooms before I put that out, not from the site itself. I just think that's a safety thing. And if you don't have to, if you're not starving, don't do it. Yeah.
Great. Move on to the next one. But first, Caitlin says, brilliant. See you in Ireland for drinks, she says.
Yes. Thank you, Caitlin.
Make it happen. All right. Greg Lemereau says, we use Stropharia, King Stropharia, in one of our restoration projects along the river. Do you think that it can survive both the cold and snowy winter and the flooding season that followed after, and now a second winter?
Yeah, because Canada is always about that winter. First, hi, Greg, because I know Greg, and I know Winlaw, where he's from. That is a really good question. One of the things that the woman I spoke about briefly, Jess Ann Rubin in Vermont, though, that was one of the questions she was trying to answer when she was doing her King Stropharia project. Like she had a bunch of different questions around how is this working and kind of how to optimize it. But she was trying to figure out the flooding piece, the freezing piece and everything. And I want to reach out to her and kind of see what she found and get back to you on that. So maybe you and I can keep talking. I think so, but I actually feel like she just figured that out. And I'd rather kind of check in and see if there's anything on that that's a bit clear.
Great. He says, thank you. All right.
You're welcome.
And Mark Deckens. Hello, Mark from the Netherlands. He's very ecosystem restoration camps movement there and all. It's good to see you, Mark. He asks, we have one of those DuPont / Kimor plants in the Netherlands that produces the Teflon layer stuff of cooking pan. Large areas have been affected. They have been keeping it under the radar for years. Have you heard of bioremediation methods that have been tested already?
I mean, because that stuff is, Teflon is, that's major toxicity. Where I'm living in kind of Louisiana right now, we're really close to kind of, we call it Cancer Alley. And it's between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And it's all the chemical refineries that are making kind of, different kind of plastic things and oil things and kind of these kind of like what you're talking about as well. And just the level of impacts to people's health and kind of the waters around there is just, you can smell the poison. It's not good. So I feel for whoever's living next to your DuPont plant. Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm sure that people have tested certain things in terms of the chemicals and using probably bioremediation on that. In terms of what we've seen in terms of testing, I think mycoremediation and mushrooms would be really powerful because, again, you're dealing with a pretty complex chemical in that situation. But I don't know if I've seen an actual thing on that. It'd be something worth looking into. Yeah.
Cool.
So, and again, you can kind of look through different kind of studies and stuff and be like, this chemical, this. I actually was looking up glyphosate earlier today because I was like, somebody always asked about glyphosate. And no one did, which is great. But you can often find studies on it, people doing bioremediation and stuff, but it's always in lab. It's rare that you find them doing out in the field. And so that's something where, again, as remediators, it's like we have to bridge that gap, because something that was done in a lab, you're going to get different results sometimes. If you do it in the field, you got to work out the kinks. So that's not quite an answer to your question, but it's something that I actually want to look into now that you asked it.
Great.
There's, well, if I could just, there's a couple of things that I've got here.
Yes.
Conventional, when you mentioned conventional remediation, it sounded like it's just hiding the toxicity under the rug. Is that the plan in traditional or conventional?
Not always. I mean, so in my book, I actually have a whole appendix where I go through the different conventional options, because I want people to understand, because there are times where, like, for example, groundwater, where we can't get at it. And there is some things that different industries have developed in terms of kind of getting down and oxygenating it and using. So I mean, it depends. Sometimes conventional remediation actually uses bioremediation, but they do it in a very conventional way, right? Like, instead of, like, they'll just spray fertilizer to get the bacteria going. Or they do in the oil industry, they like to talk about natural attenuation, where they basically are like, we're done. And they think nature will just fix itself, but they call it natural attenuation, so it sounds good. And there's truth to that. But also, if you've just like onslaughted an ecosystem with oil and it's so toxic it can't kind of get out from underneath it, your natural attenuation is not going to go so far. It really depends. I mean, again, there's some really, if you go through that, like the appendix in my book, there's some really interesting conventional remediation pieces. It's an empire. Remediation is an empire onto itself in terms of industry. And it's, I mean, if you go in the back, there's things like sparging and like there's like some vitrification where they like super amp it with energy and heat and they turn it into glass. There's some weird stuff going on. But I know when we're dealing with that conventional dig and dump, it is that kind of like move it, hide it, you know? And there's other things like land farming, where they basically take contaminated soil. And this is kind of interesting, because land farming almost could kind of veer into remediation in the way that they're like, you take contaminated soil, then you spread it out on farmers' fields. Right? And then they're saying that they're doing it to oxygenate it and help break it down, but they're not adding anything to do that. And then it's running off and actually contaminating more land and more water. And so again, it's that piece of when you have people who aren't ecosystem people coming up with these ideas and their bottom line is profit and kind of getting out from under the PR problem, you're going to see solutions that work for companies and don't necessarily work for communities and people in the long term. And the oil spill stuff, I didn't talk about oil spills. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. As you guys saw me do it once. I get really excited in a creepy way, I guess. But the amount of different like oil spill cleanup things that they do, so much of that is about kind of hiding it or kind of capturing it. And what they can't capture, hide it. You know, like it is a bit of that. And again, there's good people who work in these industries who are trying to do the right thing. But I guess my long answer is like yes to what you said, but also there are a few conventional remediation things that we will have to rely on because of the depth of the problem. You know what I mean? Like if you're dealing with something that's inaccessible by our kind of smaller kind of machines, you're going to have to go into, like in the book, we talk about like some of the stuff around groundwater remediation and what you would have to do to get at it or get it up or, you know, so I would think it's important to kind of learn from, say, what are people already doing? Try to see where it goes off and what also might be, there's some good stuff in there and not to throw everything out, you know, but to have a healthy dose of skepticism and challenging people in terms of their intentions and what the actual endpoint is supposed to be.
Great. There's a couple of things. I mean, you mentioned a number of beneficial bacteria, but I've noticed over the last, say, 25 years, when I started to inquire about microbes, there was not very much information, but there's been this explosion of classification and DNA testing and so on. How many beneficial bacteria do we have? And there must be many, many more.
Yeah, that's a good question. This is something, yeah. I mean, I think we have thousands. Like, I mean, like it's like there's huge amounts, and it's like beneficial for what? You know, I mean, not everything is for, you know, I think there's a lot of incredibly powerful microorganisms to work on. It's also something like I think about a lot of my work, like the stuff I've learned from engaging with some of the people who are the leaders or just the people who are kicking ass in this field. You know, like a lot of the bacteria stuff I learned from like reaching out to folks like Elaine Ingham or like Bob Ross, like people who are doing this work. And I can't answer that question because I'm not an expert in bacteria. Like I've kind of, in a very kind of reductionist way been like, what are the ones that I need to work with? Boom, you know, but there's a whole kind of thing around that that's far greater. And so I can't quite answer the question, but I would say the numbers are massive on that.
The filtration function of fungi suggests that maybe all sort of artificial filters with sort of submicron or something sizes could work. Is that something? Is that a thing?
I don't know what you're talking about so much.
Well, I mean, the filtration that you're getting from the mycelial net,
Mm-hmm.
to me, like some of the things that people talk about for artificial filtration, where you make a membrane that allows water through maybe, but doesn't allow for anything larger particles.
Right. What are they making it out of?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things because, for instance, arsenic poisoning that was happening in the Southeast Asia and in Bangladesh especially,
Right.
in Bengal, in the area of Bengal. That was like done. You know, I mean, it was caused by development aid. It wasn't like just was there. It was so they really felt that they had to go in and deal with it, and so they were looking around for all sorts of things, like how to stabilize the arsenic or attract it to something, or how to filter it so that you could have the water flow through the microfilter and stop arsenic.
I think in the filtration, I mean, the thing is, a lot of like people have been trying to answer these things for a long time. And I think, again, I remember when I was looking into some of the filtration stuff in terms of industry, there's a lot on that and membranes and things that they've made. I mean, and then you get into, again, the like making things from natural things, right? And then we go more into the mycelium, biochar, like working in a filtration. If you're not just working with mushrooms, like, are you also doing like another stage that involves like biochar? Like, what are your different, like, you can get really creative with this, but I think that there is a mix of like, there's people who've done the tech side of it, and then there's people who've done the biological side of it, you know? Yeah. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but it's like, I totally see what you're saying. It's like, that is absolutely there. And then things get, I don't know a lot about some of the nanotech stuff. That's not my forte. I've always been a bit afraid of it. I tend to work with things where I'm like, you are not a creepy tiny robot. We're good. You know?
Yeah, bionic systems, as you like to say, and plus it's cheaper, right? Probably than You want to make your natural disaster comment real quick, and then we'll wrap it up because
no, I'm good.
You're good. Okay.
Which one?
So you were just saying you wonder if natural disasters are often natural these days.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, when you talked a lot about natural disasters, but it looks like they're actually not natural disasters. They're disasters which are resulting from some human decision which was flawed.
I mean, there's also an interesting, like when we define, like just in terms like disaster, people do this thing with disaster where we only really call it a disaster if it impacts people and property. You know, like that's like in like how governments and like how communities, it's like if a forest falls or if a tree falls in a forest and you're not there to hear it kind of thing. And so, for example, like we've had fire on the landscape in certain parts of the continent that, you know, it wasn't considered a disaster because it was part of that landscape renewing itself, you know? But now that there's people living there and it goes kind of through their communities, it becomes a disaster. And also, not only that it's going through communities, it's going through communities where things that are built with toxic materials when they burn. And then it becomes a secondary disaster, right? And so I think that's something just in terms of like the definition piece. And also we've created, because of climate change and like forestry practices and suppression of prescribed burns, we've created fires that are not what they used to be in terms of how they burn. And so I think, the whole thing around disasters is like, there are natural disasters, like an earthquake in some ways is a natural disaster. But again, we conceptualize it as a disaster because it destroyed a city, you know, or it unleashed a nuclear disaster, like in the case of the tsunami of Fukushima, right? So yeah. And same thing with like hurricanes have always been like hitting the Gulf Coast. But again, when they hit a Gulf Coast, it also involves incredible, like intense energy infrastructure and people living behind and it becomes a whole other beast. And so the decisions we make politically and kind of in that human landscape definitely accentuate and amplify our disasters.
Great. Well, that's it for our questions and everything. We're gonna wrap up. And by the way, if a tree falls in the forest, by definition, there's always somebody to hear it, even if it's not human.
That's true.
Because if there's not a life form other than trees, then that's just a sterile plantation. It's not a forest. So there's always somebody hearing, even if we're not there to hear it. So and get a beaver chapter in your book. Okay. Boom.
Yeah. Quick though, I just want to say to people, like, I'm someone, like, I've done quite a bit of research on this. I wrote a book. I teach, but again, I learned from other people, and there's a lot of amazing bioremediators and cultivators who are doing this work, so find the people near you who are teaching, who are cultivating, who are your bacteria, your compost masters, who are incredible at propagating plants. Like, those are the people who will teach you so much. And also your herbalists and folks like that. Like, there's just such a neat ecosystem. Like Tim mentioned, your beaver folks, these are incredible people. Your folks who understand how to work with fire on the landscape. These are all your riparian restorers. These are all people who kind of create that really complex, beautiful remediation ecosystem. And so I learned it, you can learn it, everybody can learn it. It just takes a bit of time and a lot of responsibility to the topic so that you do it well.
Yeah. Leila, before we wrap, is there anything else that you would like to share with this group?
I think, we could go forever, but we got to stop at some time.
Sure.
So.
Okay. I was wondering if there's anything pressing on your heart or anything. So. Okay.
1,000 things, so no.
1,000? Nothing. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah,
and we're getting great webinar, says Greg. Alex says, thanks for this. It was great. Everybody's getting wonderful feedback. And then this will be up on YouTube, so y'all please share it. That'll be up within a couple days. And we'll see you next week for the Ecosystem Restoration Deep Dive webinar. It's not confirmed who yet, so I can't plug it yet. But thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
Great to be here. Thank you.
And thank you, Leila. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And yeah.
Quick. If I said to anybody that I was going to respond to them more in email, just email me, because I don't know your email, but hopefully you got mine from the slide.
You got her. Yeah. And then if you need to get in touch on the Ecosystem Restoration Deep Dive Facebook page or something, but yeah, I can help if need be, but you got her email, so good. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
So good to see you all.
Great to see you, Leila. I love you. All right.
Love you too. I don't know how to get out of this though.
You're going to go right now. Bye-bye.
Bye.